April 17, 1943. Over the Kuban bridgehead, the sky was a maze of contrails and smoke. Below, the Black Sea shimmered like molten steel. A Bell P-39 Airacobra, olive drab dulled by dust, skimmed just above the treetops. Inside the cramped cockpit, the pilot, a Soviet ace barely 22, steadied his gloved hands on the yoke. His canopy was streaked with oil. The engine sat behind him, a steady, vibrating growl. Ahead, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 broke from cloud cover, diving in at full throttle. The Soviet pilot didn't climb. He stayed low. The German overshot. One squeeze of the trigger, and the P-39's 37 Everythin cannon thundered once. A single shell ripped through the enemy's engine block. The Messerschmitt spiraled into the sea. To Western observers, this aircraft had been a failure. A flying coffin, they called it. But here, over the Kuban steppe, it was rewriting the rules of air combat. Because in the right hands, and in the right war, even the worst fighter could change everything. The story of America's worst fighter began not in battle, but in a conference room at Bell Aircraft's plant in Buffalo, New York, in 1937. The U.S. Army Air Corps had issued a bold requirement: a single-seat interceptor capable of climbing to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, fast enough to meet enemy bombers head-on. Bell's engineers responded with a revolutionary design. The XP-39, built around a mid-engine layout, and a 37 mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. On paper, it was a marvel. In practice, it became a cautionary tale. The first prototypes were promising. In 1939, test pilots recorded speeds over 390 mph, rivaling early Spitfires and Bf-109s. The Airacobra's sleek, low-drag fuselage and tricycle landing gear were cutting edge. It was also the first American fighter with an engine mounted behind the pilot, freeing the nose for heavy armament, a concept decades ahead of its time. But the dream began to unravel when the U.S. Army demanded simplifications. The turbo supercharger, essential for high-altitude performance, was removed to cut costs and streamline production. What remained was a machine optimized for altitude bands that U.S. pilots would rarely fight in. By 1941, as America entered the war, frontline squadrons received their Airacobras, and their disappointment was immediate. The P-39 couldn't compete with the nimble Japanese Zero or the high-flying German fighters. Above 15,000 feet, its engine gasped for air. Climb rates lagged. Pilots derisively nicknamed it the Iron Dog. To them, the Airacobra felt sluggish, underpowered, and dangerously unforgiving in dives. The Royal Air Force, desperate for fighters in 1941, ordered several hundred P-39s under Lend-Lease. But after operational testing, they quickly grounded them. British reports were brutal, unsuitable for combat operations. The aircraft was returned to American control. By 1942, the Airacobra had become a bureaucratic embarrassment, a design too advanced to scrap, too flawed to trust. Factories kept producing them, yet few commanders wanted them. For the Army Air Forces, it became a convenient tool for training or second-line defense. But as the Allies dismissed the Airacobra, thousands of miles away, another Air Force was desperate. Not for perfection, but for practicality. The Soviet Union, reeling from catastrophic early losses, needed aircraft that could survive mud, snow, and punishing low-altitude brawls over the Eastern Front. They didn't need altitude. They needed grit. In late 1941, the first batch of P-39s arrived via the Arctic convoys to Murmansk. Mechanics wrapped in frost-stiffened coats unloaded the strange tricycle-geared fighters onto the frozen docks. Soviet pilots eyed the odd machines warily. But unlike Western flyers, they weren't laughing. They saw something else: stability, power at low level, and a cannon that could shred armor. Where the West saw a design flaw, the East saw an opportunity. By 1942, Soviet aviation engineers had begun dissecting the Aerocobra's flight behavior. They quickly realized that at altitudes below 10,000 feet, where most Eastern Front dogfights occurred, the P-39's performance was not only adequate, it was formidable. Its Allison V-1710 engine, free from the stress of thin air, delivered steady power. Its tricycle gear allowed takeoffs from rough forward strips, where Soviet Yaks and Lajijis often broke their props. The cannon, a 37 Everythin M4, was both blessing and curse. Hard recoiling, slow firing but devastating. Soviet ace Alexander Pokrishkin, one of the first to master it, called it the hammer of judgment. With proper trigger discipline, he claimed, it could rip apart bombers and tanks alike. As the Eastern Front air war intensified, the Airacobra began its unlikely transformation, from failure of Western aviation to cornerstone of Soviet air power. The irony was complete. The plane Americans mocked as their worst fighter was about to become one of the deadliest tools in the Soviet arsenal. By early 1943, the Soviet Air Force, VVS, had learned an unforgiving truth. Air combat over Russia was not a contest of altitude and elegance. It was a dirty, chaotic, low-altitude struggle fought in freezing wind, mud, and chaos. The front lines moved daily. Airfields were little more than frozen meadows. Mechanics worked with bare hands under floodlights, repairing bullet-riddled engines with makeshift tools. In this brutal environment, the P-39 Airacobra fit almost accidentally. Its tricycle landing gear allowed takeoff from improvised strips, where tail draggers often nosed into the mud. Its low-slung fuselage made ground maintenance easier. The plane's center of gravity, thanks to its mid-mounted Allison engine, made it steady in sharp turns and surprisingly resistant to spins. Soviet pilots quickly discovered they could roll, dive, and climb out of combat with far more control than their Yaks or Laj-GG-3s, but what truly sold the Airacobra to the VVS wasn't comfort. It was firepower. The M4 37mm cannon, firing through the propeller hub, was unlike anything on the Eastern Front. Each shell carried enough explosive force to blow the wing off a bomber or tear through an armored half-track. While Western pilots saw its slow rate of fire as a disadvantage, Soviet doctrine favored burst discipline, single, precise shots, not long sprays. In the hands of men like Pokrishkin, Rechkalov, and Glinka, that cannon became a scalpel. Pokrishkin, who would end the war with 59 confirmed kills, personally rewrote the training manual for Airacobra units. He realized that Western manuals encouraged high-altitude boom and zoom tactics, suicidal on the Eastern Front, where air battles began and ended below 5,000 feet. His new doctrine emphasized energy fighting, maintaining speed and momentum, exploiting the P-39's stability to stay one step ahead of enemy dives. He trained pilots to use the aircraft's mass and center balance to perform rolling scissors, maneuvers that left German pilots overshooting into the crosshairs of that 37 feet. Stratter-millimeter cannon. As Pokrishkin's 16th Guards fighter regiment perfected these tactics, results began to show. Over the Kuban bridgehead in early 1943, Luftwaffe records show increasing losses at altitudes below 3,000 meters. German pilots began complaining that new American fighters were appearing in numbers, and that their turning battles ended disastrously. Behind the front lines, Soviet engineers studied recovered wrecks and shared data with American liaison officers. Ironically, most of those U.S. officers still considered the P-39 a dead-end design. They filed polite reports, never realizing that a supposedly inferior aircraft was dominating one of the most intense aerial theaters of the war. The numbers tell the story. Between 1942 and 1945, the Soviet Union received 4,119 P-39s through Lend-Lease more than half of total global production. In the US, it became a forgotten relic. In the USSR, it became the most successful Lend-Lease fighter of the entire war. More than half of all Soviet aces who scored over 20 kills did so flying Airacobras. Still, the aircraft was not without danger. Its mid-engine layout, while improving balance, left the pilot sitting atop the fuel tank. Direct hits from above or behind often ignited the entire cockpit. Soviet mechanics called it the plane that burns like kerosene. But for front-line pilots, survival had never depended on perfection. It depended on familiarity. They trusted the Airacobra to start in 30-degree seat weather, to roll off muddy fields, and to deliver its single cannon shot when it mattered. By the spring of 1943, the aircraft's reputation had inverted completely. Western analysts dismissed it as obsolete. Soviet commanders saw it as indispensable. The worst fighter America ever built had become a cornerstone of tactical evolution, a machine that defined how the Red Air Force fought and won its air war. And soon, over the Kuban, it would face its greatest test, a proving ground that would expose the truth behind both reputations once and for all. For the young Soviet pilots who inherited America's unwanted fighter, the P-39 was not a joke, it was a lifeline. When the first shipments arrived through Murmansk and the Alaska-Siberia route, few of them had ever seen a cockpit with enclosed radio instruments or an oxygen regulator. Compared to the wooden yaks and Le GG-3s, the Airacobra felt futuristic. It was heavier, yes, but solid. An aircraft that didn't shudder at high speed or shed wings in a dive. To men like Alexander Pokrishkin, Grigory Rechkalov, and Dmitry Glinka, each with dozens of sorties behind them, the P-39 represented something different. Reliability. It could take punishment and still bring its pilot home. The tricycle gear made landings gentle, and the visibility, with its bubble canopy, was unmatched. Pokrishkin, famously methodical, treated the Airacobra as a scientific tool. He spent nights charting its energy curves, measuring turn radii and dive speeds, and teaching new pilots how to exploit its center of gravity stability. The P-39 is not a gift, he once wrote. It is a responsibility. It forgives only those who understand it. To Western ears, this might sound poetic. To the VVS, it was survival logic. In a war that consumed 1,000 aircraft a month, the Airacobra's predictability was priceless. The Airacobra's supposed flaws vanished in the tactical reality of the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe's JG-52, aces like Hartmann and Barkhorn, fought in high-altitude engagements when defending deep over German territory. But the Soviets had no such luxury. Their missions were ground support, interdiction, and frontline air cover. Engagements occurred between 500 and 3,000 meters, often minutes after takeoff. In that envelope, the P-39 was a knife. Its heavy cannon could destroy Stukas, transports, and light armor with surgical precision. Pokrishkin's 16th Guards developed the Circle of Death, a defensive formation of Airacobras flying in rotating stacked rings. Each aircraft covered the other's blind spots, creating a deadly crossfire for any German fighter attempting a bounce. The tactic exploited two facts: the Airacobra's superior roll rate at medium speed and its reliable radio coordination, an advantage Soviet pilots had rarely enjoyed. German after-action reports began mentioning circling formations that could not be broken. Low-altitude dogfights became fatal traps for attacking Messerschmitts. By 1943, the Kuban battles had validated the concept. Soviet squadrons using P-39s achieved kill ratios close to 2.1, unheard of a year earlier. The Airacobra's most controversial design feature, its engine placed behind the cockpit, was originally meant to improve aerodynamics. It also created room for the 37-beam M4 cannon to fire through the nose without synchronization gears. While U.S. pilots complained of awkward weight distribution and maintenance complexity, Soviet mechanics adapted fast. The rear engine gave the aircraft a unique advantage: survivability. Hits to the nose seldom disabled the engine, allowing damaged planes to limp home. The central mass also stabilized gunnery. At short range, a burst from the M4 could destroy almost any aircraft or vehicle. Soviet engineers often modified ammunition belts, alternating high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds to maximize effect. The tricycle landing gear, once mocked for fragility, became a blessing on rough fields. Unlike tail draggers that required long takeoff runs, the P-39 could launch in short bursts, a crucial advantage during German strafing raids. The Allison engine, derated for high altitude, proved exceptionally reliable in the cold, starting in sub-zero conditions that grounded other types. Even the cockpit doors, automotive-style side hatches instead of canopies, served a purpose. Pilots could bail out faster or open them during taxiing to vent heat. What American engineers had designed as convenience became, in the Soviet context, life-saving practicality. Through these first three lenses, human determination, tactical adaptation, and mechanical reinterpretation, the era Cobra's transformation becomes clear. It was never the aircraft that changed. It was the war around it. The environment that humiliated it in the West became the forge that elevated it in the East. And as the conflict reached its decisive year, new dimensions, leadership, enemy perception, and the moral weight of borrowed machines would add depth to the story. Every war creates its own teachers. For the Soviet Air Force, those teachers weren't theorists in Moscow. They were frontline officers like Major Alexander Pokrishkin, Colonel B.N. Glinka, and Marshal A. Novikov, who dared to challenge the rigid doctrines inherited from the 1930s. The arrival of the era Cobra gave them the perfect tool to do it. Pokrishkin's unit, the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment, was the first to systematically document and revise aerial combat tactics using the P-39. They scrapped altitude-based interception plans and rewrote training manuals to focus on energy retention, teamwork, and situational awareness. Pokrishkin's famous mantra, height, speed, maneuver, fire, was drilled into every recruit. It was simple, almost mechanical, yet it captured the essence of survival. Use what the era Cobra gives you, not what it lacks. Leadership at the operational level soon noticed. Soviet Air Command began centralizing era Cobra squadrons into elite guards units rather than scattering them across mixed formations. This allowed doctrine to evolve uniformly. Coordination between fighters and ground control intercept posts tightened. For the first time in the war, Soviet pilots began fighting as a system rather than as isolated duelists. And at the center of this transformation stood an American-built plane that had once been written off as a design failure. German pilots initially dismissed the era Cobra. They described it as fat, clumsy, and unsuitable for climbing pursuit. But by the spring of 1943, those same reports took on a different tone. Combat diaries from JG-3 and JG-52 mention thick-nosed fighters with heavy guns whose pilots refused to climb and instead forced low-altitude turning fights where Luftwaffe advantages vanished. The Luftwaffe was optimized for high-energy tactics, diving, zooming, regaining altitude. Against era Cobras that fought horizontally and defended in coordinated circles, German formations often lost cohesion. A Bf-109 diving from altitude could overshoot in seconds, exposing its belly to the 37 mm Thatcher, Dalim-2 cannon. Captured Luftwaffe. Officers later recalled that the new American fighter was exceptionally dangerous in ambushes during Kuban 1943 and Belgorod-Kharkov 1943, where terrain and weather forced engagements below 1,000 meters. Pilots of JG-54 referred to them bitterly as die Cobras, noting that a single hit often disintegrated their aircraft. The psychological effect was significant. The very name Airacobra began appearing in German radio warnings, an unintentional mark of respect for a plane once mocked as useless. Behind every sortie over the Eastern Front was a logistical web stretching from Buffalo to Vladivostok. Each Airacobra carried with it a geopolitical irony. American engineers, British shipping, Soviet pilots, three nations united by necessity, not sentiment. Lend-Lease was never purely altruistic. For the United States, it was a strategic investment. Keeping the Eastern Front alive meant fewer German divisions facing Allied landings in North Africa or Italy. Yet for the Soviets, these shipments were deeply personal. They arrived in battered crates through the Arctic cold, trucks, food, boots, and machines like the P-39. Every delivery was a message. You are not fighting alone. Pilots who flew Airacobras sometimes carved small English words into their instrument panels. Buffalo, Liberty, Tex. It was a quiet acknowledgement that war had erased borders, if only temporarily. To them, this airplane was more than metal. It was proof that even in mistrust and politics, cooperation could create something deadly and effective. There was also irony in production. While American factories moved on to the P-47 and P-51, thousands of P-39s kept rolling off the line specifically for Soviet use. The U.S. didn't realize it had just built one of the most perfectly suited machines for the harshest theater of the war. A weapon no longer for itself, but for an ally fighting a different kind of war. By 1943, all these angles, leadership daring to change, an enemy forced to adapt, and an uneasy alliance of industry and survival, converged into a single truth. The Airacobra had found its destiny, and soon that destiny would be tested in the sky over the Kuban, where the reputations of aircraft and men alike would hang in the smoke-filled air. Spring 1943. The Kuban bridgehead, a patch of earth between the Black Sea and the Caucasus, had become one of the most contested airspaces of the entire Eastern Front. For months, the Red Army and the Wehrmacht had clashed along a front line stretching from Novorossiysk to Krimskaya. Whoever controlled the skies here would control the southern gateway to the Soviet heartland. The German Luftwaffe deployed its finest, JG-52, JG-3, and SG-2, squadrons seasoned over France and the Balkans, supported by Ju-87 Stukas and He-111 bombers. Their mission was clear: break Soviet defenses, support Army Group A's withdrawal, and destroy the Red Air Force once and for all. Facing them was a patchwork of Soviet units reorganized after 2 years of brutal attrition. Among them, the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment, equipped entirely with Bell P-39 Airacobras. Their commander, Major Alexander Pokrishkin, knew they were outnumbered, but not outmatched. The Soviets had radar-linked ground posts, improved coordination, and most importantly, aircraft suited for low-altitude combat. From April through June 1943, the Kuban skies witnessed some of the most intense dogfights of the entire war. Over 1,500 aircraft from both sides fought daily engagements, often in layers. German fighters circling high above 5,000 meters, Soviet Yaks and Airacobras sweeping below. Each side called it the aerial meat grinder. But this time, the grinder favored the Soviets. On April 17th, Pokrishkin's squadron intercepted a formation of Ju-87s escorted by Bf-109s near Krimskaya. Rather than climb to meet them, the Airacobras stayed low, using the terrain to mask their approach. As the Stukas began their dive-bombing runs, the P-39s accelerated upward in coordinated bursts. The first volley from Pokrishkin's 37mm Brabit front cannon shattered a Stuka mid-dive. Within seconds, chaos filled the radio waves. "Cobra! "Cobra!" shouted German escorts as cannon fire tore through their formation. Soviet ground troops below looked up to see contrails spiraling down like corkscrews. The Airacobras, painted with red noses and white tactical numbers, were relentless. Their heavy guns made short work of bombers, and their stability and tight turns allowed them to duel Messerschmitts on equal terms. The P-39's high roll rate let Soviet pilots evade vertical attacks and snap onto German tails in one continuous motion. By the end of the day, Pokrishkin's regiment claimed 12 enemy aircraft for the loss of one pilot. But the victory was more than numbers. It was psychological. The inferior American fighter had proven it could go head-to-head with Germany's best machines and win. The next days confirmed it wasn't luck. The Luftwaffe tried to regain the initiative by introducing new FW-190A fighter bombers, using hit-and-run raids at treetop level. Yet the P-39, with its superior low-altitude speed and robust airframe, countered them effectively. Soviet pilots developed reverse pursuit tactics, diving under German aircraft, then looping up to strike their bellies as they pulled out of strafing runs. The 37mm cannon was devastating in this geometry. One shell could break a Focke-Wulf in half. Meanwhile, Pokrishkin's analytical approach began shaping the battle's rhythm. He divided his squadrons into layered patrol zones, covering altitudes from 500 to 3,000 meters, each communicating through reliable American radios. This coordination neutralized German bounce tactics and created overlapping kill zones. Luftwaffe aces accustomed to isolated duels suddenly faced cohesive formations that anticipated every move. German intelligence noted the shift with alarm. Reports from Luftflotte 4 described enemy groups operating with unusual precision and superior communication discipline. One senior officer even remarked that Soviet Airacobra units fight like Americans. He wasn't far from the truth. The aircraft's design philosophy, coupled with Soviet improvisation, had created a hybrid doctrine neither side had seen before. By May 1943, Luftwaffe losses in the Kuban sector were mounting. Pokrishkin personally scored multiple victories, including 3 Bf-109s in one sortie, cementing his reputation as one of the deadliest aces of the war. His tactics were soon adopted across the entire Fourth Air Army. The Battle of the Kuban would not end with a decisive kill count, but with something deeper: the shift of air superiority. For the first time since 1941, the Red Air Force was dictating the terms of engagement. And at the heart of that transformation was the aircraft everyone once mocked, the Bell P-39 Airacobra. By late May 1943, the Kuban Air War had become a test of endurance. Both sides were flying hundreds of sorties per day. The Germans, determined to break Soviet control, committed their elite aces, Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Günter Rall, men with hundreds of kills to their names. Against them stood younger, often less experienced Soviet pilots in P-39s, guided by a handful of veterans who understood the machine's strengths like second nature. On May 28, 1943, the Luftwaffe launched one of its largest concentrated efforts of the Kuban campaign. Over 200 aircraft rose from bases in Crimea and the Taman Peninsula. Bombers, fighter bombers, and escorts. The goal was to smash Soviet bridgeheads at Krimskaya and cripple their logistics. German planners believed the attack would finally overwhelm the Red Air Force. But Pokrishkin and his staff had anticipated it. Soviet ground posts picked up radar echoes early that morning. Within minutes, formations of Airacobras and Yaks scrambled from forward strips. Engines roared across the valley floor as mechanics leapt clear of prop wash. Dust and oil filled the air. At 08:47 hours, the first formations clashed. A massive furball erupted at 1,500 meters, drawing in dozens of aircraft. Soviet spotters on the ground counted more than 60 contrails twisting above the smoke columns. Pokrishkin led from the front. His voice on the radio was calm, clipped. Cobra 1, target group right. Keep altitude, roll right. His squadron split in pairs, using the terrain as cover, then climbed sharply under the German formation. The sudden vertical strike caught the Luftwaffe off guard. The P-39's mid-engine layout gave it perfect balance in these hard turns. German pilots, expecting sluggish performance, overshot again and again. One Airacobra pilot, Dmitry Glinka, fired a single 37 Vilil 7,000 round that blew apart a Ju-88 bomber mid-flight. Fragments rained across the Kuban plain. Another Rechkalov executed a tight spiral, forcing a Bf-109 to stall and crash into a hillside. The battle lasted just 20 minutes. 20 minutes of roaring engines, tracer streaks, and radio static. When the Luftwaffe retreated, 21 German aircraft lay destroyed, with 5 Soviet losses. Pokrishkin's regiment claimed half of them. Ground observers confirmed the victories, black smoke rising in every direction. The message was unmistakable. The inferior American fighter had just helped achieve one of the most lopsided air victories of the Eastern Front to date. In the aftermath, reports flowed through command channels. Soviet Marshal A. Novikov noted in his logbook, "The Airacobra, previously underestimated, demonstrates excellent performance in low-altitude engagements. Recommend expansion of delivery and tactical study." In Germany, Luftwaffe analysts were baffled. They identified the plane by silhouette. Long nose, tricycle stance, no tailwheel, and assumed it must be a new model. "It is faster than the Yak and better armed than the LGG," one officer wrote. Its pilots do not fear close combat. The irony was brutal. The aircraft they feared most was one their own intelligence had dismissed 2 years earlier as obsolete. For Pokrishkin, the victory was not about pride, but validation. His tactical revolution, disciplined teamwork, coordinated radio command, and energy-based fighting had proven that doctrine, not just machinery, decided outcomes. The Airacobra had been a flawed design, but a perfect student of human adaptability. The momentum from Kuban carried forward into Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk, and the long advance westward. Soviet Airacobra units continued to dominate at low altitude, flying close support for tanks and artillery, escorting Il-224, C-2 Sturmovix, and intercepting German ground attack aircraft. By 1944, Pokrishkin and his comrades were legends. The 16th Guards became the first Soviet unit to receive multiple Hero of the Soviet Union decorations. Western observers finally began to notice. Reports from the U.S. military attaché in Moscow acknowledged that the P-39, while rejected in the West, has achieved outstanding service results in the hands of Soviet forces. Even so, the irony persisted. In American training manuals, the P-39 still bore the note, "Limited high-altitude capability, not recommended for frontline combat." In Europe, few remembered its name, but over the steppe, it had become a symbol of improvisation, of survival, and of a different kind of victory. As the summer sun set over the Kuban plain, mechanics gathered around returning Airacobras streaked with soot and blood. They touched the fuselages with bare hands, murmuring short prayers. These were no longer foreign machines. They were comrades in arms, proof that in the crucible of war, flawed tools can achieve perfection through human will. From that day onward, even the Germans stopped laughing because the fighter they mocked had reshaped the air war and rewritten history from 3,000 feet above the Black Sea. When the smoke cleared over the Kuban and the front shifted westward, the statistics began to speak for themselves. Between 1942 and 1945, the Soviet Air Force received 4,119 Bell P-39 Airacobras, more than any other single Lend-Lease fighter type. What had started as a diplomatic consolation prize had turned into one of the most productive partnerships of the war. In the Soviet order of battle, the Airacobra filled the exact gap no homegrown aircraft could yet cover. A rugged, low-altitude interceptor with heavy firepower, stable aim, and reliable communications. By mid-1943, Pokrishkin's 16th Guards Fighter Regiment had flown more than 5,000 sorties and claimed nearly 600 confirmed victories. Unit reports recorded operational readiness rates above 85%, an extraordinary figure for an aircraft operating from muddy, forward airstrips. The pattern repeated across the VVS. In the southern sectors, the 9th Guards Regiment used Airacobras to defend bridgeheads on the Dnieper. In the north, around Murmansk, the 19th Fighter Division used them to intercept Ju-88 reconnaissance planes and FW-190 fighter bombers harassing Arctic convoys. The aircraft's endurance and radio reliability allowed Soviet formations to coordinate over vast, featureless terrain where navigation errors could mean death. Most remarkable of all was the shift in perception. Official Soviet communiques that once dismissed American machines as unsuitable for Eastern conditions began praising the P-39 by name. When Marshal A. Novikov toured frontline regiments in late 1943, pilots demonstrated its takeoff and landing on short, uneven strips. Novikov's conclusion was pragmatic. This aircraft works where others fail. Orders followed to expand Lend-Lease requests for Airacobras and their improved sibling, the P-63 King Cobra, in the United States. Meanwhile, the transformation went largely unnoticed. Bell Aircraft, already focusing on experimental designs like the P-59 jet, quietly fulfilled Soviet contracts, while domestic publicity shifted toward the P-51 Mustang. U.S. combat squadrons had long since abandoned the P-39, consigning it to training duties. Yet across the ocean, in the archives of the Soviet Air Force, a different story was being written in black ink and red stamps. The Airacobra had become the weapon of the Eastern Front's redemption. In battle diaries, pilots wrote of its trustworthiness. In award citations, the words "flying the P-39" became shorthand for elite service. By 1944, the Airacobra's fingerprints were visible in the evolving structure of Soviet air warfare itself. Fighter regiments trained to operate as integrated ground support systems, anticipating artillery barrages and armored pushes. Radio-directed zones of fire became standard. Even new domestic aircraft, Yak-9s and LA-7s, adopted features inspired by the American machine. Improved radios, nose armament, tricycle landing gear concepts in prototype stages. And through it all, the pilots never forgot the irony. The machine everyone had laughed at became a teacher. Its weaknesses forced discipline. Its strengths rewarded precision. For Pokrishkin and his comrades, the Airacobra was not a gift from allies but a tool for self-reinvention, the bridge between the chaos of 1941 and the momentum of 1944. As the Red Army advanced westward toward the Dniester and the Carpathians, the sky above the steppe hummed with the distinct pitch of Allison engines. On their fuselages gleamed two flags, the Red Star and the white U.S. stencil of Bell Aircraft Corporation. Together, they told a story that neither nation had planned. A story of failure transformed by context, of machinery redeemed by men. By the final months of 1944, the Airacobra had woven itself into the DNA of Soviet aviation. Entire regiments now operated with doctrines inspired by its performance, not just in combat, but in training, maintenance, and even pilot psychology. The lessons learned from the worst American fighter became templates for the next generation of Soviet aircraft. When the upgraded P-63 King Cobra began arriving through Lend-Lease in late 1944, pilots instantly recognized the lineage. It was heavier, faster, better armed, yet familiar. Many veterans said the King Cobra felt like a grown-up P-39. Soviet engineers would later acknowledge that their post-war designs, especially the Yak-15 and early MiG prototypes, borrowed aerodynamic principles, first observed in the era Cobra's mid-engine configuration and tricycle undercarriage. But perhaps the greatest transformation wasn't mechanical. It was cultural. The experience of mastering a foreign aircraft forced the Soviet Air Force to adopt new standards of documentation, testing, and feedback. Every P-39 unit sent daily technical and combat reports to centralized command, something rarely done before 1943. Those reports created an enormous database of combat analytics, engine endurance, fuel efficiency, gun dispersion patterns, failure rates. Soviet officers later described it as the birth of their data-driven Air Force. Meanwhile, the men who flew the Era Cobra became legends. Alexander Pokrishkin, who ended the war as a triple hero of the Soviet Union, would later rise to Marshal of Aviation. His personal score, 59 victories, most in the P-39, made him the second highest-scoring Allied fighter ace of World War II. Grigory Rechkalov achieved 56 confirmed kills, all in Era Cobras. Together, their unit, the 9th Guards Fighter Division, became one of the most decorated formations in the entire Soviet military. Western analysts were slower to understand. In U.S. archives, the Era Cobra remained a technical footnote, a transitional design overshadowed by Mustangs and Thunderbolts. But Soviet documentation tells another story. Between 1942 and 1945, P-39-equipped units accounted for over 12,000 German aircraft destroyed. Roughly 30% of all VVS fighter kills during that period. No other Allied aircraft type produced so many aces in Soviet service. The Era Cobra's legacy extended even into Cold War geopolitics. In the late 1940s, when Soviet and American officers met at international conferences, both sides remembered the aircraft. One as a rejected prototype, the other as a national hero. U.S. officers were often astonished to learn that the plane they had deemed obsolete had become the workhorse of Soviet victory. In Moscow's Central Air Force Museum today, one P-39 still stands, olive paint fading, canopy cracked, the red star still bright. Below it, a small plaque bears Pokrishkin's quote, "It was not built for us, but we made it ours." That single sentence captures the paradox of the Era Cobra. It wasn't innovation alone that made it historic. It was reinterpretation. The aircraft's story became proof that context defines value, that tools built for one war can triumph in another if wielded by the right hands. And in that lies the deeper meaning of its legend. The Era Cobra didn't just change tactics or statistics. It changed the mindset of a military machine learning to adapt under fire. It showed that victory favors not the perfect, but the flexible. By the war's end, as the red banner flew over Berlin, hundreds of P-39s still flew low over the wreckage, their propellers churning the smoke. Their pilots veterans of 1,000 sorties. Many would soon be scrapped or left to rust on forgotten fields. Yet in every Soviet fighter that followed, from the MiG-9 to the MiG-29, a trace of that failed American design lived on, a reminder that sometimes the road to greatness begins with rejection. History remembers its champions, but rarely the ones that stumbled into greatness. The Bell P-39 Era Cobra began its life as a compromise, a sleek promise undone by technical shortcuts and shifting doctrine. It was mocked, sidelined, and nearly forgotten. Yet in the crucible of the Eastern Front, that same flawed design found the war it was built for. It became a mirror, one that reflected a truth about humanity and warfare alike. Success often belongs not to the strongest, but to those who adapt. When Western pilots dismissed the P-39 for its lack of altitude performance, they were right. In their sky. But thousands of miles away, In the gray haze above the Kuban, that same limitation became a strength. At low level, where the fight was dirty and personal, the Aerocobra's stability, visibility, and firepower made it a perfect companion. The Soviet pilots who flew it didn't ask what it couldn't do. They discovered what it could. And that difference, in mindset, not machinery, changed history. In the quiet decades that followed, the Aerocobra's story became more than a technical anecdote. It became a parable about cooperation across borders, about the strange alchemy that occurs when nations, engineers, and pilots converge under impossible pressure. The American engineers who designed it never met the Russian aces who mastered it. Yet together, they created a weapon greater than either side intended. Today, the Aerocobra stands not as a monument to perfection, but as an anthem to reinvention. It reminds us that even the most underestimated creation can transform the course of a war, if placed in the hands of those who see potential where others see failure. So when we look at that stubby-nosed, mid-engined fighter resting in the dim light of a museum, we don't see an embarrassment of American aviation. We see the ghost of the Kuban, the machine that rose from mockery to mastery. And in its propeller scars and scorched paint, we find a timeless lesson. Even the rejected can become legendary when the world finally catches up to what they were built to do.